welcome to Sustainability Live. And if you're watching the recording, then also welcome to Sustainability Live. So this is I don't know whether this is the first episode of Sustainability Live or episode 68 of the ESG Show. Sustainability Live is kind of the ESG show, really, just a couple of changes. First of all, hopefully it's slightly improved, a slightly more all singing, all dancing version, because, you know, you learn from these things, the more you do, the better you get at them. So hopefully it's a wee bit better. And the other thing is we're broadcasting 3 times a week. I suppose I should quickly tell you why we're doing Sustainably Talking. And there are 2 reasons, really. The first reason is to talk to the sustainability community, which is probably people like you. Why? To educate, inform, inspire, and to entertain. And then in addition to that, we also seek to evangelize some of the core concepts of sustainability to a wider audience, to business leaders, investors, and also, you know, a cynical public, really. Obviously, broadcasting 3 times a week is a massive challenge, and we want to produce a show which is good as possible and provides as good a service as possible for the sustainability community, and also to evangelize to that wider audience, which hopefully will help the sustainability community. For that reason, in the near future, we will be asking people who watch the show regularly to make a modest contribution of £10 a month. It's about $12 a month. Not today. This episode is completely free. But then of course the videos that would be evangelizing it, which we'll be pushing out like crazy, will be sent to as many people as possible. Anyway, that's enough about that. Let's get on with today's show, and I'll bring on our guest in just a few seconds. So, you may remember back in the early 2010s, the euro had a bit of a crisis. And then Mario Draghi was the European Central Bank head at the time, and he said he would do whatever it takes to save the euro. Well, you know what? Super Mario did. The euro was saved, and I think a case could be made to say that right now the EU is a wee bit stronger. And not only that, countries like the UK and Canada are looking, I think, to move closer to the EU, because I think there's an awareness that the middle-sized countries need to be a little bit more united. But then around 18 months or so ago, Mario Draghi only went along and did it again. But this time he produced a report suggesting that there should be a degree of rewinding of EU regulation. And then we saw a backlash against regulation. So I'm joined today by Professor Andreas. I'm sorry, Andreas, I'm almost certainly going to get your name wrong. Andreas Rasche. Have I said that correctly?
That was good, actually. That was good, Mike. Yeah.
Well, how about that? Well, between you and me, I'm 69% Scandinavian, although I don't know how that happened. I think that was probably about 500 years ago, probably descended from Vikings or something. But anyhow, great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Could you just say a little bit about yourself? Just introduce yourself to our audience this morning.
Yeah, so I'm a professor at Copenhagen Business School, also one of the associate deans of the school. And I'm doing research on sustainability, particularly with a focus on EU regulations, so the interface between regulatory developments and sustainability. This is the area I'm working on, in particular with regard to reporting and due diligence.
Okay, well, we seem to have the right man then to be talking about regulation this morning.
Indeed.
And in particular, I kind of paraphrased it as a backlash against a backlash. There's a backlash against regulation, but I think you're a little bit critical of the people who are criticizing the regulation. I don't know whether that's a fair thing to say.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is a fair thing to say. I mean, I always try to kind of give a balanced perspective, and I'm critical against this backlash for sure.
Okay, so a couple of quick questions for you. What is regulatory uncertainty?
Well, I think it is something that we're seeing right now, right? I mean, lack of clarity around new and also existing regulations. I would say both with regard to when they come and how they will be adopted. And the when probably is quite important because we've seen a lot of delays and postponement throughout the last 12 to 16 months.
Okay, and what is the paradox of simplification?
Yeah, I mean, I've framed that term I think, in one of my LinkedIn posts, and I actually got a lot of feedback on it. What I mean is that simplification, of course, is supposed to save costs. This is the whole point. But simplification itself also creates cost. It causes costs. So this is what I call the paradox of simplification, a cost-saving measure that in itself actually is quite expensive.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, this is a scary moment. I'm just going to pull up a few comments. It's scary because I don't know what these comments say yet, so I'm about to find out. Hi all, hello to you, and hello to you as well. And oh, voice is too low, Mike. Can you hear me all right there, Andreas?
I can hear you well, Mike. So for me, it is perfectly fine.
Okay, well, I've turned the volume up full. And hello to you, and hello Agnes. Hello Agnes. So anyhow, let's get back to some questions. So can we drill down? Frederick Eriksson of the European Centre for International Political Economy famously said, "We have become the Silicon Valley of regulation." Andreas, do you have a feel for what he meant by that? And is he right? Had the EU become the Silicon Valley of regulation?
I guess what he meant is to kind of say, well, we have too much red tape. There is too much regulation out there. There is a need to streamline regulations, and I agree. I mean, there is a need really to streamline existing regulations, to look for efficiency. But then there is also a need to kind of uphold the spirit of the regulation. So you cannot just say, we need to simplify. It is also important to kind of protect the prudence of the regulations itself. So in a sense, we talk about a fine balance. There is need for simplification, but it needs to be done in a way that you protect what is there, particularly when we talk about environmental regulations, sustainability related regulations. And also when you look into data, I mean, there is an OECD study that came out and that basically shows, that work that is needed for compliance in the EU did not increase more than it increased in other regions. So in a sense, I think we sometimes also over dramatize this argument, that the EU is all about regulations. It is true, we have many regulations, but other regions do as well. And there are many reasons why we have regulations, because, for instance, also we have new developments, AI and so on. And of course, this needs to be regulated.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, whilst you were talking, I was fiddling around with the volume, so hopefully I've sorted out any problems of it being too low. But please scream or shout or do whatever you want to do if you still can't hear me very clearly. So has it gone too far? So we've had this backlash against regulation. Are things all hunky-dory now? Is everything great now? Or has it gone too far, do you think?
I think, I'm not a friend of kind of saying there is too little or too much regulation. What I think is the question, do we regulate the things that need to be regulated? And do we do this in a way that we achieve relevant policy objectives? So I think these are the questions that I think we should ask. I think this question of too much, too little, I don't think this is that this is really so relevant here. And I think at the moment, we do not necessarily regulate at the scale the things that need to be regulated, particularly when it comes to environmental and sustainability related regulations. And unfortunately, we have seen in the past, I studied this now for over 20 years, that voluntary obligations, voluntary standards, particularly in the sustainability field, they only go a certain way. So in this sense, regulation needs to catch up vis-a-vis other areas. And in other areas, of course, regulation is already much more established. Think, for instance, about financial accounting. Nobody is really complaining about too much regulation in financial accounting or financial reporting, because this is really a more established field. So in that sense, I think we need to hit the right balance. I do not think that with regard to at least sustainability, we are quite there yet. And maybe we can discuss also why throughout this episode.
Okay, thank you for that. And encouragingly, I've had some comments saying the sound's much better now. No idea what I did. I just gave my phone a funny look, but it seems to have done the trick anyway. And another comment there. Okay, so thank you for that comment there. Now, I understand other parts of the world, places like China and indeed Dubai, have kind of leapfrogged the EU a little bit in regulation. Is that true? What were your thoughts about that?
Well, it's not a race, right? I mean, you cannot kind of say who regulates the most, but what certainly happened is that countries like China and also Dubai, they have caught up with regulatory developments, particularly in the sustainability sphere. China just came out with national reporting standards in a trial version, by the way, based on double materiality. Dubai came in 2024 with a rather ambitious, I would say, climate law that also covers reporting. So in that sense, things are happening. And of course, Europeans used to be proud of the so-called Brussels effect, right? You have regulations in Brussels that are decided by the EU that also, due to the strength of the EU economy, kind of influence what is happening in other parts of the world. And I would say that this Brussels effect has taken a serious hit over the last years. Some even say it has turned into a Brussels defect, and in a sense that we roll back quite a bit of regulation. So I think we need to be careful here that we don't move from being a rule maker to being a rule taker, because if the rules for European businesses are written elsewhere in the world, that's also not what we want.
Okay, so we've gone from the Brussels effect to the Brussels defect, or possibly. One thing that I've often thought about the EU is that it does like to do its shopping at acronyms are us, and one of my favourite acronyms is CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and I gather this is being watered down somewhat. So before we go any further, Andreas, could you just briefly remind people what Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is?
Yes, indeed, Mike. I mean, we have many acronyms, of course, for different regulations, and indeed, sometimes it is quite confusing. So the so-called CSDDD, the due diligence directive, is about due diligence processes for the company, but also for the value chain in order to identify environmental and social risks. So this is the basic approach. This is the basic idea. It follows a risk-based approach. And this is important to state, because the directive does not say you need to monitor all your suppliers. So this is not the intention. The intention is really to focus on those aspects of the chain where violations of environmental and social rights are most likely and most severe. So this is the idea, this risk-based approach, and in that sense, I think it is a good system. By the way, also with extraterritorial reach, because also companies outside of the EU are in scope if they meet certain scope criteria. So in this sense, actually, we see a directive that is concerned with the activities of the companies themselves, as well as what is happening in the value chain, mostly in the upstream chain, so the supply chain, but also some downstream activities are included.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, what I quite like about CSDDD, it's the way it also looks at human rights in the supply chain or the value chain. And I think that's quite interesting, because I know we've had guests on the show in the past from emerging markets who quite like what the EU is doing. They feel it's sort of almost their friend in a way. But anyhow, how is it being watered down?
Yeah, I mean, it was watered down quite a bit, and I think it is important to say here that when the CSDDD came or was adopted in its original form, that was in May 2024, it was already very, very contested. There were heavy battles within the EU. Some member states, among others, Germany, they were pushing very hard against it. So the CSDDD 1.0, so to say, was already a watered down version. And now we had the omnibus process last year. And what happened was that the scope, so the regulatory scope, who is included and who's excluded in terms of companies, has been narrowed down further to companies with more than 5,000 employees and more than 1.5 billion euros global annual turnover. And this just leaves, our calculations show this just leaves a little over 1,000 group companies actually in scope of this directive throughout Europe. And this is where you actually see, of course, that that the impact has been diluted quite a bit. Also, the climate transition plans, or the necessity to write or to actually design such a plan has been deleted. Whereas in the reporting legislation, that's important to say, in the CSRD, you still have an obligation to report, but the behavioral standards on these climate transition plans that existed within the due diligence regulation, they have been deleted. And finally, I would say they introduced a quite interesting value chain cap, which I'm actually not that critical of, because I think it meets the reality of many companies. So in that sense, also a useful change. And that also comes back to what I said before. Simplification as such is not all bad if it is done in a reflective and reasonable way.
Okay, great, thank you. Simplification is not all that bad if it's done in a reflective and a reasonable way. I like that. We've had a couple of questions, and I think it'd be quite nice, if that's okay with you, we could deal with these kind of as we go along. Stella has said, how valuable do you think it is to study how organizations respond to regulatory frameworks under uncertainty, especially in cases where there is no clear legal obligation and limited or no organizational activity? Do you have any thoughts about that question?
It's very relevant. That's why we're studying it. So we are currently, so Stella, we are currently doing one project on this. Of course, it's related to the omnibus, where regulatory uncertainty right now is extremely high. And I would say one of the really very, very critical outcomes of the omnibus is that it has increased regulatory unpredictability for European businesses. And this has also created, I would say, a loss of trust in EU institutions. And this, of course, shapes their decisions. So we are, for instance, interested in, will they adopt voluntary reporting standards, even though there is no legal mandate anymore? And this has a lot to do with the uncertainty they are experiencing. So I cannot share any results yet because we don't have them, but certainly relevant to study it.
Okay, thank you for that. And one more question. This is from a LinkedIn user. I don't know why some LinkedIn users, their name comes up and others don't. I've never have been able to work that one out, but it does. So UK SRS attempts to unite frameworks and reports, which is a step in the right direction. Will international legislation move in a similar direction or continue to compete? We need less acronyms. Well, I'd agree about the acronyms. Andreas, any thoughts about that question?
I agree about the acronyms for sure. Yes, I mean, I think international legislation, I think if you mean by international legislation in different parts of the world, most certainly. I think this is the way we need to go. We need to go towards a high level of interoperability. I think this is realistically and pragmatically the only way we can solve that problem. Also, in order to avoid that companies need to, for instance, do dual reporting or kind of replicate work in different jurisdictions. So it is really, really important that we do this, but we need to do it in a way that we also preserve the integrity of the different national laws that exist.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, if we could just go back to what we were talking about before I asked you those questions. We were talking about the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And you said recently, if a major economy like Germany has only 280 companies left in scope, the overall impact of the legislation is inevitably diluted. So what impact will this dilution have, do you think?
Well, I think it will make it really more difficult to uncover social and environmental risks in areas where we know that these risks exist. So, I mean, look at high-risk sectors, look at textile, agriculture, farming, mining. These are sectors where you know that you have significant environmental and social risks and also potential rights violations in the chain of activities. If you now start to descope firms from this directive and basically tell them, well, you don't need to do this anymore, you know less about these risks. And this is not good for the company, and it is not good for society, because you can only act on these risks if you really know something about them. So I think it has a lot to do for me with information provision. And companies, unfortunately, very often do not know where, for instance, their raw materials come from and what kind of social and environmental risks are involved in the production of these, or extraction in some cases, of these raw materials. So I think the impact dilution is real, unfortunately, and as I said before, you have some companies in scope, roughly 1,000 in Europe and a little bit more, I think more than 400 beyond the EU. All of this is good and fine, but we need more in order to really create the impact that is needed to address some of the significant risks.
Okay. Also, I guess all supply chains have got a beginning and an end, and often it's the very, very large organizations sit somewhere in those supply chains, often at the end, but not necessarily. So even if there's a lot of dilution of CSDDD, is it not possible that, yeah, but most of the supply chains are going to have one of these big companies in them anyway, and that's going to force all the other companies to comply, or don't you agree with that?
No, certainly. I agree with that in quite a lot of cases, of course, you have major companies involved in the chains, but there are also many cases where major companies are not directly involved. So in that sense, I think we cannot run the argument to say, let's focus on the biggest 1,000 and let's hope that this covers the rights violations sufficiently. I think we need a more comprehensive approach.
Okay, thank you. Had a few more comments. Under both UK SRS and CSRD, companies must disclose climate transition plans. Technically, how should these plans be integrated into the strategy pillar of the annual report, rather than existing as a standalone document? Voluntary reporting are different than this query. But Bhavani Sharma asked that question. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's absolutely right to kind of say you need to integrate this into the strategy pillar of the annual report. And I think you can do this mostly, I would argue, through CAPEX investments. So those kind of things that are really strategy relevant in the climate transition plan. So this is where you have the bridge. And in this sense, I think you're absolutely right. Integration is key. I personally see it mostly through CAPEX investments and also the governance topic, because you need to describe how climate transition plans are governed, and governance is key for strategy and enacting strategy.
Okay, thank you. And then we've had a question from Sebastian. Sebastian Biggeratu. I hope I said that correctly. At least I know I said Sebastian correctly anyway. It's in a very fragmented world, difficult to see any convergence in terms of norms and standards. It's more of an observation than a question, I think, but is that an observation you would agree with?
I would certainly agree. We are in a quite fragmented world, and it's getting more fragmented, actually. Of course, you have initiatives like the ISSB, right, and they kind of push through different jurisdictions. But overall, I think we see more fragmentation, regionalization, nationalization in a lot of circumstances, and that makes it very, very difficult to find level playing fields on these environmental and social problems.
Okay. And then we got a comment from, Stella has responded to your answer to a question earlier. Nice to hear. I'm also studying this in public sector organisations in the EU context, especially linked to the omnibus changes. We would love to learn more about your work and if you have any relevant authors or articles to recommend. Perhaps I could ask you just to take a look at a comment after the show and, do what's...
Reach out on LinkedIn, Stella. Reach out on LinkedIn and we will take it from there.
Okay, thank you for that. And then finally, one more question. It's back Bhavani Shankar again. How does the Omnibus Directive harmonise reporting requirements between CSRD, CSDDD, and EU taxonomy to prevent overlapping data collection? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, there was some attention to this. I think it was mostly solved on the CSRD level. Through the revision of the ESRS system, so the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, where quite a lot of indicators actually that were duplicates within the standard, but also with regard to the other regulatory elements like the CSDDD and the taxonomy, they were deleted. So in that sense, the system is a little more streamlined. A little bit of redundancy actually sometimes is not a bad thing. So that's why I think you need to understand the system as kind of being interconnected. So for instance, the work you do on the due diligence side feeds into the reporting side. So I think we don't need big overlaps, but a little bit of redundancy sometimes can be a good thing.
Okay, all right, get it. So as per normal, I always panic when I put these shows together, thinking, I don't have enough questions. We're going to run out, and we always run out of time. We've only got 8 minutes left, and I've got loads of questions left to ask you. So I'll talk quickly. I also read that some organisations believe that this so-called simplification of regulation does itself carry a cost. So in trying to simplify things, there's a cost involved in that as well. So why is that, do you think?
Well, that relates to the paradox I was talking about earlier. And I mean, you have different cost blocks here. First of all, you have what I would call, economically speaking, sunk costs. You already invested, let's say, in EUDR systems, and EUDR is delayed by another year. Of course, your investment is worth less. Then you have a lot of legal and consulting fees. There were some very nice reporting on this by Politico a couple of weeks back, where they interviewed quite a bit of people in the industry, and they said, well, these omnibus files are actually quite complex, and we need help, actually external help, in order to understand them. So that's the second cost block. Third cost block: not all companies immediately run away from regulations whenever they're put out of scope. So you have quite a bit of voluntary compliance as well, particularly on the reporting side. Companies that have been reporting, let's say, for 10 years on sustainability, they don't immediately stop just because the law changes, because their stakeholders are used to it. Third cost block. And the final cost block, I would say, are the kind of foregone benefits of regulations, because the assumption, I think, of the EU was very much, well, you have reporting, you have due diligence, this is all very costly. But of course, you always need to see costs in the context of benefits, and these regulations also create benefits.
Okay, so to surmise then, I think the issue why oversimplification can itself carry across is because the sunk costs, legal and consulting fees, voluntary compliance, but also green benefits. Can we just drill down a little bit on the green benefits? What are they?
Yeah, it depends a lot on the regulation. So look at the CSRD, for instance. A lot of business partners, they ask for the information. Here in Denmark, for instance, you have banks asking for the information. If you want to take out a loan, banks often want your emissions profile in order to do their own risk calculations. And then, of course, you have the own management that uses the information. If you want to manage your carbon emissions, you need to measure your carbon emissions. So in that sense, the benefits are external and internal. They do not just exist on one level. And then for the due diligence regulation, we discussed that before. You have improved risk management, and you can then go on. You can say you save, for instance, on legal fees and improve the company's risk profile by actually having very well managed and very well designed due diligence processes.
Okay, thank you for that. So you told me when we were speaking on the phone a few weeks ago that the EU sees regulation as a way to create industrial policy. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, what I meant was, the EU is not backtracking completely from sustainability. What they are doing is they are reframing sustainability. The Green Deal 1.0, so that was 2019 to 2024, was very much about, environmental ambitions, environmental messaging. Now they reframe it a bit and they basically couple it towards industrial policy. So there was the Industrial Accelerator Act that came out in March, and that basically frames decarbonization as being about independence. And this is also, of course, it directly hits the nerve right now with the Iran war that we are seeing. There is a very high fossil fuel dependency in Europe. 58% of our energy is fossil fuel imported energy. So decarbonizing is not just about the environment. This is about independence and absorbing energy shocks. And then you also have the Circular Economy Act coming later this year. This is not just about recycling. This is also about higher autonomy from raw material imports. The EU is awfully dependent, for instance, on China in terms of critical raw minerals. So whatever we have in the union should stay in the union, for instance, when it comes to battery recycling in the context of EVs, and this is something they will push for. So sustainability is very much alive, but it's being reframed.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about that. The resilience thing and the war in Iran is just highlighting this. It astonishes me how so many people interpret it the opposite way. To me, the what's going on right now is screams that we've got to have a more resilient supply chain and become less reliant on oil. But anyhow, if that regulation is a way to create greater resilience, why do we need regulation? Why don't the markets do it anyway? Have you any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think in a very short answer, you can say, well, markets are too short-term focused. But for resilience, you also need a longer-term focus. If you talk about decarbonization and the effects that I was just talking about, you need to think beyond 2 to 3 year business cycles. But markets don't tend to do this by themselves. So the incentives are set in a different way. And hence, we need regulations on that.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions. And I've got 2, possibly 3 more questions for you, and we're supposed to be finishing in 3 minutes. I hope you're okay if we go a couple of minutes over, but I don't want to go many minutes over. Fine. If you could, just try and speak at 1,000 miles an hour for the next few questions. The European Commission has also abandoned the Sustainable EU Food System Initiative. And you said this is a deeply flawed decision. Why do you think that?
Well, I think I was very sorry to see that go, because the initiative itself was one of the few initiatives that really took a systems view. And I'm a big friend of that. It viewed food provision and food consumption in context. So food touches upon many different areas: environment, climate, biodiversity. But then also you look beyond and you look at agriculture, health. And these interconnections, they were made in this initiative. And actually it was supposed to provide a unified regulatory framework. And unfortunately, that didn't happen, but it was the other way. It was sacked just a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, thank you. So the EU is also talking about aligning the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS. I mean, why not have another acronym while we're at it? With ISSB, these acronyms. So first of all, can you explain what ESRS is and how it differs from CSRD?
So ESRS are the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and these are the standards that really contain the indicators for reporting, while CSRD is the directive that fixes who needs to report and how the reporting process itself should be organized. So in that sense, you can, to simplify it a lot, you would say ESRS answers the what question, and CSRD answers the who and how question. So this is, of course, very, very simplifying, but I think it meets kind of or it kind of gets the gist across.
Okay, all right, great. And how significant is this idea of alignment with ISSB, do you think?
Yeah, it's very, very significant, and because the world outside of the EU is quickly moving towards ISSB adoption. You have 40 jurisdictions that have already adopted ISSB, and it is a good standard. Let's not forget that. So in order to avoid dual reporting for EU companies, you actually need close alignment with ISSB. But, and that's important, we need to preserve the European double materiality principle in all of that. We cannot have a kind of a system where ISSB kind of takes over the European standards. And I also do not think we will get there. It is just important to mention.
Okay, thank you. 3 more questions, but one's for me. Can we kindly request recordings, Michael Baxter? The recording of this episode will be on will remain on LinkedIn in perpetuity. So you just click on the recording. But yes, if you want the recording, I'm sure we can sort something out somehow. Okay, Stefan said, is the trend of more transparency potentially leading to more simplicity, but just with the temporary stress of frustration that follows compliance work and learning?
It's a quite complex question, so I would need a long time, but let me make it short. Yes, to a certain degree, you always simplify when you provide transparency for larger audiences, because you quantify, you make things very dense. That's something that you cannot really circumvent. And in that sense, I have argued also before that this kind of very standardization of information, quantification of information, of course, also has its downsides. But on the other hand, you need to see what are the alternatives. So I think if you want to connect sustainability to the financial markets, you need to swallow that that pill.
All right, just 2 more. I don't think we've answered this question yet, Renee. How prepared are companies in the EU, UK to assemble and operate the requisite elements of the disclosure in their risk frameworks? Which companies would be the ones needing most help?
Again, very, very big question. I think how prepared are they? I think that depends a lot on corporate size. I think for the bigger companies, I would say they are probably quite prepared. For the smaller, mid-sized companies, probably not so much, but this has a lot to do with internal management processes. And there is quite a bit of literature on this already.
Okay, thank you. Bhavani, I think Bhavani is the questioner of the day. I think this is your third question, Bhavani, I think, if I remember correctly. Do we strictly prune our DD reporting to the chain of activities to reduce liability, or do we keep cradle to grave reporting to satisfy investor-led IFRS 2 requirements?
Well, that depends on which legal framework is relevant, I would say. I think in Europe, you see, of course, quite a bit of due diligence reporting around the chain of activities, not necessarily just to reduce liability, but simply also to remain compliant in a sense. So I think in that sense, I would say it depends on where you sit in terms of the jurisdictions. IFRS S2 certainly, and you are absolutely right to point it out, there is a bit of a divergence here. So let's see how this will be addressed, particularly with the ESRS ISSB discussion going on right now.
Thank you. Last question. I beg your pardon. Last question. Is it possible to quantify the impact of the trickle-down effect?
Depends on which trickle-down effect. I think as long as you attach enough assumptions to something, you can quantify most things. The question is how meaningful the quantification is. And this is something I would really ask everybody to consider. Quantification as such always needs to be meaningful, and it needs to be transparent which assumptions have shaped the quantification. I see quite a bit of quantification these days where I would say, we actually, when looking at the assumptions, probably this is not so meaningful. So to make a long story short, yes, you can.
Well, thank you very much. No more questions, just a couple of observations. Very, very concise session. Looking forward to your next session, Andreas Rasche and Stefan. I'm a fan of you guys. Thanks for sharing. Thank you, Stefan. Your checks in the post for that comment. Professor Andreas Rasche, thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you, everybody, for watching this. Hope you found this informative. We've got a show tomorrow. Hope you can join us then. And see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining, everybody. Bye-bye.